In a packed courtroom, Justice Clarence Thomas slammed his gavel like a thunderclap and slapped Jasmine Crockett with an outrageous $500 million fine for contempt. The chamber froze. Reporters dropped their pens. Lawyers exchanged stunned looks, the sheer weight of the number roaring louder than the gavel itself. But Jasmine didn't flinch. With one explosive folder and a 47-second recording, she transformed the trial into a battlefield of truth versus power. What happens when the untouchable judge finally gets exposed? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom was suffocating with tension, every breath dragging heavy under the marble ceiling. It was a federal ethics hearing, but the chamber felt more like a battlefield. From the high bench, Clarence Thomas glared down, his voice a blade cutting the silence. Representative Jasmine Crockett, for contempt of this court, you are fined $500 million. He slammed the gavel so violently the wood cracked against the desk, the sound echoing like cannon fire. This court will make you an example, he snarled, his fury shaking the room. The number landed like an explosion, $500 million. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Attorneys stared in disbelief, and the public gasped as if the air had been sucked from their lungs. It wasn't punishment, it was annihilation. A sum meant to erase her career, her name, her fight. Eyes turned toward Jasmine, expecting collapse, expecting her to crumble beneath the crushing weight. But Jasmine Crockett did not move. She sat upright, hands steady, her gaze locked on Thomas with a cold fire that refused to dim. No blink, no tremor, no sign of fear. In a chamber trembling with shock, she was the only one unshaken. Her silence cut sharper than words, and for a fleeting second, it was Thomas's rage, not Jasmine's defiance, that felt out of control. The echo of the $500 million verdict hadn't even faded when Clarence Thomas launched into something far worse than any financial punishment. He began tearing at her identity. Still seated high above, he leaned forward with fire in his voice, hatred in his stare. His finger sliced through the air like a dagger, aimed straight at Jasmine. You are an amateur, a disgrace to the law. The words weren't just insults. They were missiles, fired in front of the entire nation. It wasn't enough for him to fine her into silence. He wanted to humiliate her, to shatter her reputation so completely that no one would ever listen to her again. He didn't stop. His voice rose like a storm, echoing off the cold stone walls of the courtroom. You don't belong in this court, he bellowed, shaking the bench with the sheer force of his rage. Even the court officers flinched. A sound like that didn't just demand obedience, it declared war. He wasn't acting like a judge anymore. He was a man cornered, lashing out, hoping that if he shouted loud enough, the truth wouldn't catch up to him. Across the room, people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in the gallery turned away, unable to watch what looked like the unraveling of someone's career in real time. One of the younger aides near the back leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "He's trying to destroy her." A reporter clenched her jaw, fingers frozen above the keyboard, unsure whether to keep typing or to bear witness. Every eye turned toward Jasmine, expecting her to wilt under the pressure, to crack like so many before her had under the weight of unchecked power. But Jasmine Crockett didn't crack. She didn't blink. She didn't so much as twitch. For a long moment, she just sat there, completely still, absorbing every insult without letting a single one sink in. The silence stretched, awkward for the audience, unbearable for the man shouting down at her. It was the silence of calculation, of control, of something far more dangerous than resistance, clarity. And then, with terrifying calm, Jasmine stood. She didn't push back her chair loudly. She didn't raise her voice. Every movement was deliberate, razor-sharp in its poise. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as she rose, head high, shoulders squared. She looked straight into the eyes of the man who had tried to annihilate her with words and numbers, and without a flicker of hesitation, she said, "Are you finished?" The chamber froze. The tension became physical, thick as smoke, sharp as glass. The tension pressed against the walls, pressed into lungs, making even the strongest people in the room forget how to breathe. Her words were quiet, but they detonated louder than any gavel. She hadn't raised her voice, but she had just flipped the entire room upside down. That moment didn't just belong to her. It swallowed the courtroom whole. And somewhere behind his polished veneer, Clarence Thomas realized she wasn't there to survive. She was there to fight. The room was still smoldering from Thomas's last outburst when Jasmine moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the calm of someone who knew exactly what she was holding. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a thin, yellow-tabbed folder. No binder, no briefcase, just one understated file that carried the weight of a wrecking ball. She stepped forward, heels clicking softly on the marble floor, and approached the clerk's desk. Her voice was low, steady, unshaken. "Please enter that into the record." The clerk blinked, confused, then took the folder hesitantly, like it might be radioactive. He opened it slowly, eyes flicking down the first page, then the second. His fingers paused. One breath, two. Then his posture changed. He sat straighter. Jaw tightened. The gallery watched his reaction before they even knew what the contents were. Something had shifted. Something was real. Inside that folder were sworn depositions from forensic accountants, a chain of internal emails between senior corporate executives, and 3 complete sets of financial disclosure documents, each page marked with verified timestamps, legal authentication, and official certification seals. The evidence wasn't speculative. It was precise, brutal, undeniable. Names, dollar amounts, bank routes. It didn't suggest wrongdoing. It carved a trail directly to the bench. The heart of it was devastatingly clear. Justice Clarence Thomas had undeclared financial ties to 3 of the 4 private companies that had aggressively pushed for the unprecedented fine of $500 million against Jasmine Crockett. The first company, Halberd Strategies, a powerful political lobbying firm based in Washington, D.C., financial records revealed that Thomas's family trust had quietly received $215,000 every quarter in so-called consulting dividends from a limited partnership tied to Halberd. These payments began 1 month after Halberd formally submitted a policy package titled Strategies for Sanctioning Hostile Congressional Disruption, a document that used the same phrases later echoed in the official court ruling against Jasmine. The second company, Triarch Holdings International, a global corporation in real estate and energy markets. Emails included in the folder showed that Triarch offered Thomas a private speaking contract worth $400,000, broken into 4 luxury retreat appearances. One such appearance was hosted just 2 weeks before an internal legal memo proposed record-setting punitive measures against Representative Crockett. The third company, Velinex Equity Partners, a high-capital investment group focused on deregulation initiatives. The documents proved that Velinex had funneled $3.2 million to a judicial outreach foundation where Clarence Thomas held an honorary advisory position. That money traveled through a Caribbean-based account, then re-emerged inside a national political fundraising organization known for defending judicial immunity from financial oversight. One line from an internal communication shook the courtroom. Velinex recommends neutralizing Crockett before she gains public momentum on court transparency legislation. This wasn't circumstantial. This wasn't guesswork. Everything was signed, time-stamped, corroborated, and now locked into the official court record for all to see. The silence cracked like glass. Whispers exploded across the room like gas meeting flame. A journalist dropped his pen and didn't bother picking it up. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth, visibly shaking. One man muttered, "Jesus Christ," or under his breath, forgetting he was still on camera. Every eye in the courtroom was now locked on the clerk's trembling fingers and the papers in his hands. And then came the roar from the bench. "Lies! Smear tactics!" Thomas bellowed, his voice raw with rage. He stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor behind him. His palm slammed down onto the wood, the sharp crack echoing like gunfire. But this time no one backed down. No one obeyed. His voice, once godlike in that room, sounded hollow, shrill, like a man yelling to drown out thunder. The moment had broken wide open. The first truth had been laid bare, and with it, the cracks in Clarence Thomas's power had begun to show. The courtroom was already unsteady, like a tower beginning to sway. But Jasmine wasn't finished, not even close. Without changing her expression, she reached into the folder once more and pulled out another set of documents, this time bound by a red clip. She handed them to the clerk with the same coolness as before. Not a word wasted. But everything in the room changed the moment the clerk peeled back the first page. His eyes didn't scan. They locked. The blood drained from his face in real time. This wasn't just financial paperwork anymore. It was a blueprint for how power moved in the dark. The top page was a verified guest log, a formal record from a luxury private club in Palm Beach. The date was bold, 3 months ago. The entry, Justice Clarence Thomas, seated for dinner with Willcraft Holdings Executive Board, including the CEO, General Counsel, and lead policy strategist. No public announcement, no media coverage, just wine, steak, and off-the-record intentions. Beneath the guest list was a handwritten note, recovered through subpoena. Discussion, strategic discipline against committee agitators. The handwriting belonged to Willcraft's legal chief. The timestamp placed it 30 minutes after Thomas was seated. But it was the next attachment that detonated like a bomb. A confidential internal memo, written 2 weeks after that dinner, circulated among Willcraft's senior legal team. Its title, Targeted Sanctions Framework, Phase 2, Representative Jasmine Crockett. It was damning on its own, but what came next pushed the courtroom to the edge. The language in the memo was identical to the phrasing Thomas later used in his written judicial opinion against Jasmine. Not paraphrased, not similar, identical. Lines like, repeated defiance of this body shall be met with extraordinary consequence to preserve institutional integrity. That exact sentence appeared in both the internal corporate memo and Thomas's final ruling, down to the punctuation, down to the italics. The silence shattered. A low murmur swept through the crowd, multiplying by the second. The gallery began shifting in waves, shoulders tightening, eyebrows lifting, heads turning. One judge on the far end of the bench leaned toward his colleague and whispered urgently, the tone unmistakably alarmed. The court clerk's brow glistened with sweat as he turned the next page, his fingers trembling now. A paralegal in the front row dropped her stylus with a loud clack, but no one flinched. Not at the sound, not anymore. This wasn't a theory. This was replication. Cut and paste. Justice Clarence Thomas had mirrored the language of a private memo, authored by a corporate entity with direct financial interest in the case. And now that memo was public record. From the bench, the reaction was immediate and volcanic. "Order! Order!" Thomas bellowed, slamming the gavel down so hard it cracked against the grain. His voice tore through the chamber, but the authority behind it had vanished. His face flushed an angry crimson, the veins at his temple bulging. The rage wasn't righteous, it was exposed. His tone, once dominant and final, now rang with desperation. But the room wasn't listening to him anymore. Because in that moment, what slipped wasn't just his temper. It was the illusion of neutrality, of distance, of fairness. And once that mask began to fall, it didn't stop. The chamber hadn't yet caught its breath when the weight of truth finished doing what no verdict, no title, no robe had ever done before. It cracked him. Clarence Thomas didn't just react. He detonated. With both fists clenched, he leaned forward and slammed his hands against the bench. Not once, but twice, the sound so violent it made the microphone screech. His voice tore through the courtroom, no longer a gavel of law, but a warning shot from a cornered man. "You will be silenced," he roared, each word soaked in fury and desperation. His face was flushed deep crimson, his eyes wild, jaw locked so tight the muscles in his temples twitched. This wasn't the voice of a judge. It was the howl of a man whose power had just met its limit, and knew it. Then came the command. He pointed directly at Jasmine with a trembling hand, as if willing her out of existence. "Get her out of here, now!" He barked at the court officers, his tone breaking like glass. 2 guards instinctively took a step forward, one already reaching for the radio on his chest. The room shifted. Chairs scraped back. The press clutched their cameras tighter, breathless. Every corner of the courtroom tensed, waiting for the next rupture. For one fleeting second, It felt like history was about to be dragged out by force, but Jasmine didn't move. Not an inch. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't flinch. Instead, with the stillness of someone who had already seen this moment coming, she calmly lifted one hand, not to protect herself, but to stop time. And then she spoke. This silence is over. 5 words, ice cold, perfectly measured. Spoken like a gavel that didn't need slamming. Her voice didn't need to rise. It cut through the chaos, not by volume, but by clarity. The impact was immediate, sharp enough to pierce through concrete, loud enough without needing to be loud. And for a moment, everyone stopped. Even the guards froze. Then slowly, it began. A man in the gallery stood up. He didn't speak. He just stood. Then another. Then 2 more. Then 5. One by one, row by row, people across the courtroom rose to their feet, silently but unmistakably. No chants, no shouting, just quiet, unified defiance. Their message wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Clarence Thomas turned toward them, expecting obedience. But all he found were eyes no longer afraid of him. His gavel sat inches from his hand, but now it looked like a toy. His shout for order had collapsed into an echo. The guards glanced at one another and didn't move. Because in that moment, for the first time in that courtroom, Clarence Thomas wasn't the one commanding silence. He was standing in the middle of it, and the silence had chosen its side. The silence had chosen its side, and Jasmine wasn't done. With no hint of triumph, no flash of emotion, she reached into her blazer once more, this time not for paper but for a small black USB drive. Matte black, heat-sealed, and marked with a white label, Chain 47, authenticated. She held it between her fingers for a second longer than usual, like she understood the weight of what it carried. Then without a word, she walked it to the clerk. Her voice was flat, calm, controlled. "Play track 2. That was all she said. The clerk glanced at her, confused, almost startled, but obeyed. He plugged the drive into the court's audio system. The speakers crackled once. The screen on the side monitor blinked to life. The waveform appeared, and then the voice, not just any voice. Clarence Thomas, recognizable, undeniable, unedited. The fine is bait. Hit her with 500 million. Break her spirit. He wasn't speaking to a courtroom. He wasn't delivering a ruling. He was speaking privately, to a room full of political strategists and lobbyists. The tone wasn't formal. It wasn't restrained. It was casual, cruel, and clear. The plan wasn't to uphold the law. The plan was to target Jasmine Crockett with a penalty so overwhelming she'd collapse under it. The audio continued. The second voice, male, lower in pitch, smug, responded with approval. "That'll make her fold. No one can stand up to that kind of pressure, especially not her." A pause followed, some quiet background rustling, then Clarence Thomas again, unmistakable and unbothered. "She'll either back off or burn out. Either way, we win." And then silence. Not in the recording, but in the courtroom. It didn't just gasp. It cracked. A reporter in the front row dropped her phone, the plastic case skidding across the floor. Someone in the gallery let out a sound between a laugh and a sob, hands covering their mouth in disbelief. The judge seated at the far left edge of the bench visibly stiffened, his eyes darting toward Thomas, who still sat frozen in his chair. One of the court security officers turned away from the doors and locked his gaze on the bench. Not for protection, but in pure, stunned disbelief. And then the clerk stood up, so fast that his chair scraped and toppled behind him with a crash. His voice shook as he held up a printed sheet of paper, half trembling, half dripping with fear of what he was about to say. The voice matches, metadata verified. The words echoed like a formal sentence. Not shouted, not embellished, just declared, like a trigger being pulled. Time, location, signal integrity, all confirmed. This file is authentic. Silence followed, but it was a new kind of silence. Not stunned, not confused. This silence carried weight, like the seconds before a structure collapses under its own lies. It was the sound of power cracking. Clarence Thomas didn't say a word. He couldn't. His lips parted, as if trying to form a sentence, a denial, anything, but no sound came. His mouth moved like muscle memory, like a man trying to remember how authority used to work. His hand twitched. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it reached for the gavel that now sat meaningless on the bench, but his fingers didn't close. They hovered, trembling, not from age, from exposure. The blood had drained from his face, leaving behind something pale and waxy. His eyes blinked once, twice, rapidly, as if trying to reset a reality that no longer listened to him. One elbow pushed into the armrest for stability. His other hand stayed frozen in the air, as though even the act of grabbing wood might betray the panic flowing through his veins. He didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't. She remained standing, arms by her side, saying nothing. Her face was calm, not smug, not victorious, just focused, like someone who had been waiting for this moment, not to win, but to reveal. This wasn't rebuttal. This was revelation. This wasn't protest. This was proof. And it had just been served in his own voice. Somewhere in the second row, a legal aide whispered, "That's it." A judge on the far right slowly pushed back his chair. The press began typing furiously. Not commentary, not speculation. They were typing history. One outlet's camera zoomed in, catching the precise moment Clarence Thomas's eyes dropped. Not to the evidence, not to the court, but to the floor beneath his bench. The image was unmistakable. A man trying to disappear. The final blow had landed, not from cross-examination, not from testimony, but from his own mouth, sealed in time, handed over by the woman he tried to crush. And now, as the chambers stared at him, judges, reporters, staffers, guards, Clarence Thomas had nothing left to say. The gavel, still untouched, might as well have been made of glass. There was no motion, no objection, no ruling. Because at that exact moment, there was nothing left to defend. And that's what made it a knockout. Not the volume, not the drama, the simplicity, the purity of truth, delivered raw. He had scripted his own undoing, and Jasmine had simply hit play. No further evidence was needed. No raised voices. No more exhibits. Because the room had already decided. And for the first time in his 3-decade career, Clarence Thomas was not feared, not followed, not believed, but completely and utterly exposed. But outside those walls, the real explosion was just beginning. The moment the audio leaked, the country buckled. It didn't just make headlines, it hijacked them. No morning show, no breaking news segment, no streaming service could compete with what became known in every corner of the country as the Crockett Files. Newsrooms fell silent the moment the clip played. The fine is bait. Hit her with 500 million. Break her spirit. That voice, undeniably Clarence Thomas, echoed across breakfast tables, barbershops, waiting rooms, and rush-hour radios. Gasps turned to curses. One woman in Milwaukee reportedly threw her phone at the TV. No one could unhear it. No one wanted to. The question came instantly from every screen, every mouth, every post. Did Justice Thomas abuse his power? And it didn't stop echoing. Talk shows demanded answers. Radio hosts raged. From left-wing podcasters to center-right columnists, the outrage wasn't partisan. It was visceral. People weren't debating. They were boiling. A single line had torn open something far bigger than a courtroom scandal. It exposed a mindset, an entire machinery, running behind robes and formality. By noon, the streets had a pulse of their own. Washington, D.C. saw the first crowd gather. But it wasn't quiet. It was thunderous. People showed up with signs reading, $500 million equals silence, and this is not justice, it's revenge. Soon Atlanta erupted, then Detroit, then Oakland. In New York, marchers surged past City Hall, chanting in waves. Outside the Supreme Court, they blasted the audio clip on portable speakers. Each time it ended, they screamed, "Did he abuse his power? Is this justice? Who speaks for us now?" The energy was undeniable. Parents brought children. Teachers walked out early. Even military veterans showed up in uniform. One retired Navy officer raised a sign that said, I defended the Constitution, not corruption in a robe. Inside Congress, the shock wasn't any less severe, just more frantic. Staffers sprinted between offices with printouts of the leaked transcript. One senator reportedly slammed his fist on a table after reading the line, "Break her spirit." In a closed-door meeting, an aide was overheard saying, "If we don't act, this court will fall from within." And then came the firestorm at the White House. In the briefing room, chaos reigned. Reporters shouted over each other. Does the president still support Justice Thomas? Will there be an official ethics review? Is the administration investigating collusion? The press secretary took the podium but struggled to speak. After a long pause, she delivered only 10 words. "We're monitoring developments closely and will respond when appropriate." Those 10 words were replayed on every network. Analysts didn't just dissect them, they tore them apart. One former Justice Department official called it the clearest signal of internal distancing I've ever seen from this administration. Across the country, emotions turned into movements. Protesters camped overnight outside federal buildings. In Los Angeles, someone projected the words "break her spirit" across the side of a courthouse. In Philadelphia, digital billboards blinked for 3 hours with the question, "Did Justice Thomas abuse his power?" Inside Jasmine Crockett's office, chaos became strategy. Her staff had to rent extra servers to handle the email traffic. Within 48 hours, over 120,000 messages flooded in. Some were brief. "We believe you." Others were emotional. "I played the clip for my daughter. She cried." One email stood out. "I worked at the firm in 2019. Tell Jasmine to check the black drive." Legal analysts, stunned at first, began to mobilize. One former federal prosecutor said, "This isn't judicial misconduct. This is judicial warfare." A professor from Stanford added, "It's not just the fine, it's the intent." He weaponized his robe. Within hours, civil rights groups filed formal petitions. Ethics organizations demanded immediate hearings. An emergency session of the Bar Association was called. In 72 hours, over 9 million people had signed an open demand for impeachment inquiry. Protests transformed into vigil lines. People held candles, not just for Jasmine, but for what they feared was dying: trust. At one protest in Chicago, a young law student stood on the courthouse steps and shouted into a megaphone, "If justice falls here, it falls everywhere." Her voice cracked mid-sentence, but the crowd finished it for her. The Speaker of the House reportedly received over 400 calls per hour. Internal emails leaked showing leadership scrambling to hold the line. One congressional aide wrote, "The donor class wants us to stay quiet. The people want us to scream." Even late-night comedians broke their usual script. One host held up the transcript on air and asked, "How do you explain this to a 12-year-old?" The crowd didn't laugh. They didn't clap. They just listened. Back in D.C., an unconfirmed tip began to spread. A whistleblower, someone who'd been in the room when the plan was first mentioned. A name, a signature, a file. The theory? Clarence Thomas wasn't the only one involved. The alleged lobbyists, the coordinated fine, the cover-up. All of it might have been bigger than anyone imagined. But for now, only one thing was certain. The voice was real. The words were deliberate. And the damage had already reached the foundations of power. No matter what happened next, America had changed. The public wasn't whispering anymore. They were shouting. From courthouses to campuses, from newsrooms to living rooms, one question refused to fade. Did Justice Thomas abuse his power? And every second that passed without an answer made the silence feel more like an admission. The protests roared. The headlines screamed. But what came next wasn't just noise. It was the system hitting back with everything it had. At exactly 6 a.m., the marble halls of Congress awoke to a sound louder than any chant in the streets. A 5-line memo delivered to every major newsroom in Washington. The Oversight Committee will open a formal investigation into judicial conduct, effective immediately. No explanation, no qualifiers, no spin, just pure political combustion. By sunrise, the nation had a name for it: the Crockett Inquiry. This wasn't just a title, it was a warning shot. The establishment, long silent, had now turned its gaze on the Supreme Court itself. And the face on every screen wasn't that of a sitting justice. It was Jasmine Crockett, the congresswoman who had cracked open the silence with facts, fire, and a 47-second recording that would haunt the bench forever. Inside the committee room, everything changed. No more side eyes. No more smirks. Staffers walked like they were carrying live ammunition. Binders full of financial disclosures, transcripts, sealed emails, confidential expense ledgers. Jasmine didn't show up with flair. She walked in without cameras, wearing the same charcoal blazer from the day she was fined. The room didn't rise, but it watched her. Closely. Because now she wasn't just a target. She was the storm. The chairman began without fanfare. His voice was crisp and calm, but his words hit like a gavel to the skull. This is not about political vengeance. This is about the integrity of our highest court. When a justice says, break her spirit, we don't stay quiet. We investigate. Silence fell so fast you could hear phones vibrating beneath desks. Every reporter knew what that meant. Clarence Thomas wasn't just being questioned, he was being cornered. From the first hour, the Crockett inquiry moved like a machine. Every hearing was live-streamed. Every document entered into public record. Subpoenas went out fast. Email servers, corporate accounting firms, even security accessed logs for private judicial events. It wasn't a witch hunt. It was an excavation. The pressure built not by spectacle, but by cold, uncontestable fact. One ledger showed $248,000 paid to a nonprofit with no listed address. Another email confirmed an off-record dinner hosted by a law firm with 3 active cases in front of Thomas. But nothing detonated the room like that now infamous recording. It was played again, this time at full volume. Jasmine sat in the front row. She didn't react. She didn't blink. She let the words do the work. Hit her with $500 million. Don't let her rise again. Break her spirit, not just her case. The voice was his. The intent was brutal. And the impact was irreversible. Across the aisle, one Republican congressman actually removed his glasses and put his face in his hands. Another whispered something inaudible before exiting the chamber. But the most telling moment came minutes later, when a clerk entered the room with a sealed envelope. Within that envelope was a bombshell, a motion filed on behalf of Justice Clarence Thomas, stating, Justice Thomas respectfully recuses himself from all current deliberations until further review. The media didn't need time to digest it. They pounced. CNN broke in mid-segment. Fox switched its headline bar within 30 seconds. MSNBC brought in 5 legal analysts before the motion even finished being read. The New York Times posted a one-line alert that simply said, Thomas recuses. Crockett wins round 1. On the courthouse steps, reporters scrambled for statements. Flashbulbs snapped like popcorn. Protesters erupted in chants, not against the court, but for its accountability. A young man held a cardboard sign. It only took 47 seconds to hear the truth. Beside him, a woman in a wheelchair shouted into a camera. She didn't just speak, she bled for it, and now they have to answer. Inside the Capitol, the mood was shifting, fast. What began as a defense of decorum had become a reckoning. Conversations turned to systemic failure, ethics, precedent, possibility. Could Thomas return? Should he? Did the court need external oversight? One moderate senator leaned into her mic during a closed-door session and asked the question now vibrating through every institution in America. If this isn't misconduct, what is? Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't post. She didn't give interviews. Instead, she released a one-line statement through her office. This isn't about me. This is about the country I swore to protect. And with that, the game board reset. But Clarence Thomas was no longer a player. He was now the subject of an inquiry bearing someone else's name. Not a fellow justice, not a fellow man, a congresswoman from Texas who refused to bow, even when the highest robe in the land told her to sit down and shut up. He didn't recuse because he wanted to. He recused because he had no choice. The Crockett inquiry didn't just shake the room. It shattered the architecture of trust that had held for decades. There are moments in American legal history that redraw the map. Brown versus Board, Roe versus Wade, Bush versus Gore. But none of them had the raw human combustion of what just unfolded inside the Crockett inquiry. This wasn't a ruling from on high. It was a collapse of a man, of a myth, of a system. And across Capitol Hill, in every legal office, chamber, and courthouse, no one could look away. The phrase moved fast, from court clerks to cable networks to Ivy League panels. An unprecedented fall from the bench. Clarence Thomas had not just lost a hearing, he had lost the illusion of immunity. His voice, once feared and final, had been cornered into silence, not by a justice, but by a freshman congresswoman. And in the world of law, silence means something. It means the evidence speaks louder than you can. Within minutes, constitutional law professors scrambled to rewrite their lecture notes. This is bigger than a scandal, one said on NPR. It's jurisprudential tectonics. Another wrote on social media, "We tell our students that no one is above the law." Jasmine Crockett just proved it in real time. In downtown D.C., the American Bar Association held an emergency ethics briefing. The panel, normally dry and procedural, had to address the roaring elephant in the room. The moderator didn't mince words. The integrity of the judiciary is not a tradition. It is a trust. And when it breaks, especially at the top, the tremors are seismic. At least 4 state-level judicial boards called for independent reviews of their own ethics systems within the same week. The fallout wasn't just federal, it was viral in every legal corridor that had ever quoted Thomas in a decision. One of the most chilling reactions came from a retired federal appellate judge, live on CNN. What just happened in that hearing room wasn't just a blow to a man. It was a blow to the black-robed illusion of perfection. Crockett didn't scream. She cited. She didn't accuse. She unveiled. And then she paused before saying what millions were beginning to whisper. Thomas wasn't ambushed. He was overdue. By midday, op-eds exploded from every direction. The New York Times headline screamed, "The bench just buckled." The Wall Street Journal countered with, "When a titan falls, who inherits the gavel?" The Atlantic ran a feature titled, "The Crockett Doctrine, Fearless Accountability in the Age of Deference." But none hit harder than the Washington Post. Justice Clarence Thomas, from authority to afterthought in 47 seconds. The article chronicled the slow erosion of unchecked power, describing how decades of silent complicity had finally cracked under the weight of one voice that refused to be silenced. Jasmine didn't bring weapons. She brought documentation. She didn't throw punches. She cited policy, precedent, and receipts. And that, the piece concluded, was more lethal than any gavel. Inside the legal community, reactions were visceral. One Supreme Court clerk anonymously told Politico, "You could feel it, like watching a cathedral sink into the ground, stone by stone." Another clerk added, "We're trained to protect legacies." But maybe the legacy is the problem. Even former justices were forced to weigh in. Retired Justice David Souter, known for his lifelong discretion, broke his silence in a letter to the Harvard Law Review. "We are stewards of public confidence, and if we lose that, our robes mean nothing." The message was clear. The collapse wasn't just about one man. It was about a culture of insulation finally being pierced by the sharp edge of consequence. At law schools across the nation, students filled lecture halls to overflowing, begging for faculty to address what had just unfolded. One professor from Georgetown started his class with a single sentence on the board: "What happens when the system finally listens to the person it was built to ignore?" The discussion lasted 3 hours. The impact, far longer. Crockett's name began circulating as more than just a firebrand. Some called her the legal earthquake. Others, more poetically, said she was the echo of every unheard voice in a courtroom. And as reporters dug deeper, it became clear this wasn't a media moment. It was an institutional reckoning. Ethics watchdogs began combing through sealed opinions. Former clerks were subpoenaed. Transparency bills were drafted in 3 states within 48 hours. Still, the most devastating quote came from a lifelong conservative constitutionalist who had once spoken at Thomas's confirmation hearing. His voice cracked on MSNBC as he said, "I watched a man I admired crumble today, not because of lies, but because of truths he couldn't answer." Crockett didn't ruin him. He built that silence himself. In think tanks, legal journals, and editorial boards, the phrase unprecedented collapse wasn't thrown around casually. It was underlined, bolded, and circled. Because no Supreme Court justice in American history had ever been publicly cornered like that. No robe had ever looked so heavy. No silence had ever been so deafening. And no hearing had ever rewritten so much, so quickly, with so few words. Because this wasn't about politics. It wasn't about party. It was about a moment when truth walked into a room and power had no answer. And now, for the first time in history, Justice Clarence Thomas would not be remembered solely by his rulings, but by the moment he said nothing, and the world heard everything. And once the collapse of Clarence Thomas reached every corridor of power, it was no longer just about accountability. It became a reckoning. Nobody in Washington slept that night. Inside the marble walls of the Capitol, the news wasn't just spreading, it was detonating. Every office buzzed like it was under siege. A Supreme Court justice had frozen on record, choked on his own legacy, and left the system exposed like a cracked foundation. Phones rang, staffers ran, lobbyists pivoted, allies vanished, enemies multiplied. But one word echoed louder than the panic: change. This wasn't a scandal that could be buried. It wasn't just about one man. It was about a machine that had moved silently for decades, sheltered by prestige, hidden by robes, and guarded by an unspoken rule. Judges are untouchable. That illusion shattered in under an hour. And when the smoke cleared, lawmakers looked around and realized the fire had started right under their feet. They couldn't pretend it was a misunderstanding. Jasmine Crockett had brought the proof: the sealed records, the payments, the offshore funneling, the burner email between chambers, the 47-second recording that still hadn't stopped playing in people's heads. The people had watched it unfold live, and now they were watching what would come next. The pressure was immediate. Congressional aides described it as a flood with no escape route. Protests erupted outside the Capitol, not with chants, but with silence. Thousands holding signs that read, "No more shadows." Inside, committees scrambled. Long-forgotten bills on judicial ethics were pulled from dusty drawers. But none of them were strong enough. None matched the moment. So they built something new. The first reform hit like a thunderclap: mandatory asset transparency for all federal judges, especially Supreme Court justices. Every property, every stock, every trip, every jet, every secret gift from a billionaire friend. No more hiding behind technicalities or clerical filings. If you wielded the Constitution, you had to show the people what wielded you. Next came the watchdog. Not a panel of political allies, not an internal review, but an independent judicial oversight board armed with subpoena power, investigative authority, and public transparency. Its members couldn't be elected officials, couldn't be donors, couldn't be controlled. For the first time in U.S. history, the people had a civilian-led body that could look at the Supreme Court and say, "Show us everything." The pushback was fierce. Some judges threatened resignation. Some senators tried to stall the vote. Old guard legal scholars called it an attack on judicial dignity, but their words landed like feathers in a storm, because the public had seen too much, and they weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. The bill passed the House, then the Senate. Then the president signed it in a televised address that cut away from a foreign policy briefing just to make room. But it wasn't the official name that stuck. It wasn't the Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act. That sounded like wallpaper. No, the people called it Crockett's Law. They whispered it in law schools. They printed it on protest banners. They engraved it on TikTok thumbnails, on courthouse walls, on the lips of everyone who'd once believed the system was too big to bend. It wasn't branding, it was tribute, not to a politician, not to a moment, but to a line drawn in the sand. Crockett never asked for the law to bear her name. She never said yes. She never said no. But the name caught fire because it felt earned, because she hadn't won a debate. She'd caused a tectonic shift, because she didn't just survive power, she beat it with truth, and everyone saw it happen. She didn't hold a rally, she didn't throw a party, she didn't even post. But when the final vote came through and cameras begged for a statement, She stepped behind the podium without notes, without spin, and gave them one sentence. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. That's what I did. There was no cheering. There was no applause. Just a stillness in the air so heavy it felt like time paused. Some called it a mic drop. Some called it a verdict. Some said it felt like the end of an era. But it wasn't the end. It was the trigger. Because for the first time, kids in debate clubs quoted a congresswoman over a president. Professors revised textbooks. Legal podcasts rewrote their intros. Mock trial teams played back Jasmine's hearing footage like game tape. And in the basement of one high school in Baltimore, a group of girls spray-painted a mural on the gym wall. Jasmine holding a folder in one hand and the Constitution in the other. The caption said, "The court doesn't speak last. Truth does." This wasn't about ego. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about Clarence Thomas anymore. It was about a system that had made fear a requirement for entry, that had told people to wait their turn, to stay quiet, to accept half-truths and handshake deals. And Jasmine had lit a match inside it, not to destroy, but to expose. Because you can't fix what's rotting until you see the mold. She didn't destroy the court. She rebuilt its spine. Not everyone celebrated. Some called her dangerous. Some called her disrespectful. Clarence Thomas never commented again, and the judicial silence remained his only legacy. But for millions watching across the country, the message was unshakable. You don't need to scream. You don't need to scheme. You just need proof. And a spine made of something no robe can touch. That was the lesson. That was the revolution. And that was why Crockett's law wasn't just ink on paper. It was an open wound for the corrupt and a blueprint for everyone else. No medals were handed out. No parade rolled through Texas. Jasmine didn't even change her routine. She just kept walking the same way she always had, straight, steady, and sharp. But now every step left a crack in the marble. When the chambers grew quiet and the fire of headlines dimmed, what remained wasn't the scandal or even the law. It was the lesson carved into the conscience of a nation. History doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it slips in like a thief in the night, changing the locks while no one's looking. But this time, it came crashing in, loud and undeniable. A Supreme Court justice had fallen, a system had been forced into the light, and a congresswoman who was never supposed to win stood tall with nothing but proof in her hands. That ending left behind more than reforms. It left behind a message so sharp it cut through marble, through tradition, through the centuries-old myth of untouchable power. Jasmine Crockett never pretended this was about her. She wasn't building a legacy for her own name. She wasn't auditioning for higher office or polishing her resume. She was fighting for something far bigger. The idea that in a democracy, silence is complicity and evidence is the weapon of the powerless. Her words that day were simple, but their weight could crush stone. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. That's what I did. It was more than a quote. It was a survival code for a country that too often asks the weak to endure, while the powerful enjoy immunity. Look closely and the lesson becomes clearer. Power is loud. Proof is louder. For decades, the system taught people to fear titles, robes, gavels. Judges were treated like oracles, their words final, their motives unquestionable. But Jasmine stripped the paint off that illusion. She didn't call herself a hero. She didn't even raise her voice. She just opened the file, pressed play, and let the truth walk into the room. That's all it took. And it worked. Because truth, once visible, doesn't need volume. This story teaches us something uncomfortable. That justice doesn't live in monuments or marble. It lives in the willingness to confront. And confrontation is never easy. Jasmine didn't walk into that courtroom with certainty. She walked in with risk, with fear, with the weight of knowing failure could end her career. But she also walked in with evidence. And that was enough to turn her fear into fire. There's drama in every revolution, but rarely is it so quiet, so surgical. The Crockett story wasn't about mobs, wasn't about riots, wasn't about shouting down opponents. It was about one woman, standing with a folder, daring to face centuries of hierarchy. That kind of bravery doesn't just inspire, it unsettles. It tells every person watching that the gap between them and change might be thinner than they think. Because here's the deeper truth. Systems survive not by strength, but by silence. By convincing people that they can't win, that the fight isn't worth it. Thomas tried to use that silence as a weapon. A $500 million fine wasn't punishment, it was intimidation, designed to shut her up and warn anyone else who might follow. But Jasmine flipped the script. She showed that silence can also work in reverse, that the silence of power, once exposed, becomes the loudest indictment of all. And so the lesson spreads. When they try to bury you under weight, don't fight the weight, expose the hands holding it down. Jasmine reminded us that survival isn't about matching force with force. It's about bringing light to the shadows where power hides. Proof doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to campaign. It simply needs to exist, to be undeniable, to sit in the record like a ticking bomb. That's what she placed in front of the nation, a truth no one could bury again. But what makes this lesson human, not just political, is its reach beyond the courtroom. Think of the single mother fighting eviction against a landlord with endless lawyers. Think of the factory worker dismissed after reporting unsafe conditions. Think of the students silenced in classrooms for demanding fairness. The message is the same. You may not have money or allies or rank, but if you have truth, you have a weapon stronger than any robe or gavel. Jasmine didn't just fight for herself. She fought to prove that the powerless are not voiceless. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. It's not just advice for the courtroom. It's advice for life. For every argument where arrogance tries to drown you out. For every office where corruption hides behind titles. For every system that thrives on making you feel small. Proof is the equalizer. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, known or unknown. It simply stands. And when it stands, no amount of shouting can knock it down. And yet, there's another layer to this story. Proof alone isn't enough unless someone dares to use it. How many whistleblowers have been silenced? How many documents buried? Jasmine's courage wasn't just in having the evidence. It was in deciding to hold it up, knowing the storm it would unleash. That's the second part of the lesson. Courage and proof are inseparable. One without the other is powerless. Together they are unstoppable. This lesson hurts those who benefit from silence. That's why Thomas cracked, why his allies vanished, why the system scrambled. They weren't afraid of Jasmine. They were afraid of what her victory revealed, that their fortress was paper thin, held up not by strength but by fear. And once fear is gone, power collapses under its own weight. That collapse, televised and recorded, became the human moment people will never forget. The robe wasn't the loudest thing in the room. The truth was. The beauty of this lesson is in its transferability. Jasmine's fight doesn't end with her. It belongs to everyone who watched. It belongs to the teacher challenging unfair policies, to the nurse exposing corruption in healthcare, to the citizen demanding accountability in government spending. She proved the formula. Evidence, courage, persistence. That's how you fight a system bigger than yourself. That's how you turn intimidation into opportunity. And that's why the story doesn't feel like a personal victory. Jasmine never walked out smiling, never gloated, never treated it like triumph. Because it wasn't. It was something heavier, a demonstration of survival, a reminder that one person can expose what many are too afraid to touch. And that lesson is worth more than any headline. Because the deeper human truth is this: injustice doesn't collapse when it's shouted at. It collapses when it's proven. And once proven, it can't be unproven. That permanence is what Thomas feared. It's what systems built on shadows fear. And it's why Jasmine's story is no longer hers alone. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt crushed by power and dared to imagine fighting back. So when Jasmine said, "That's what I did," it wasn't arrogance. It was invitation. An invitation to every listener, every viewer, every citizen to ask themselves, what will you do when power comes for you? Will you shrink? Will you wait for someone else to fight? Or will you gather your proof, hold it steady, and let truth do the cutting? The lesson is clear. This wasn't the victory of a politician. It was the victory of principle, the victory of proof over posturing, of truth over intimidation, of courage over silence. And if we forget that, then we betray not just Jasmine, but ourselves. Because systems don't stay broken on their own. They stay broken because people allow them to. Jasmine refused. She forced light into the darkest room in America. And in doing so, she handed us the torch. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. That's what I did. It is not a slogan. It is a commandment, a warning, a roadmap. And if the nation listens, really listens, then her story won't just be remembered, it will be repeated. And when the roar of protest quieted and the marble halls stood still again, what truly remained wasn't the scandal or the inquiry or even the law itself. It was the message seared into the nation's conscience. The message was never small, never personal, never a footnote in political theater. It was heavy, human, and impossible to ignore. It lived not in the chambers where the gavel fell, but in the streets where ordinary people whispered her words like scripture. For years, America had been taught to bow before robes and titles, to treat power as something holy, above question, beyond reach. But Jasmine Crockett shattered that illusion. She showed that justice isn't given by the powerful, it is demanded by the brave. And when she spoke not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced. Her words cut sharper than any verdict. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. That's what I did. That single line was more than advice. It was a survival code. In a nation where power so often devours truth, Jasmine offered a weapon anyone could wield. Not a sword, not a slogan, not rage. Proof. Cold, undeniable, inescapable proof. It was the antidote to intimidation, the equalizer in a rigged fight, the one thing power fears because it cannot crush what is already undeniable. That was her message, and it spread like fire. The simplicity of it masked its danger. For those who lived on secrecy, her words were poison. Silence had always been their shield. Intimidation had always been their weapon. But Jasmine flipped the battlefield upside down. She taught people that you don't have to match power with power. You break it with light. And light, once cast on shadows, cannot be called back. That is why her lesson hit so hard. Because it didn't stay in that courtroom. It crawled out into every workplace, every street corner, every kitchen table where people asked themselves, what would I do if they came for me? And that's when the message grew even bigger. It wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about Clarence Thomas. It was about the universal truth that injustice survives only as long as people look away. The moment someone refuses to look away, refuses to stay quiet, refuses to swallow the lie, everything begins to crack. Jasmine's courage showed that the crack doesn't have to come from an army. It can come from one person, standing with evidence in their hand and steel in their spine. The message is uncomfortable, and it should be. It doesn't let anyone off the hook. It says you can't wait for heroes. You can't trust systems to clean themselves. You can't believe that justice will arrive gift-wrapped if you sit patiently enough. The system is only as clean as the people willing to expose its rot. And Jasmine showed that exposing it requires one thing above all else: proof. Not feelings, not assumptions, not whispers. Proof. That's why her final line wasn't poetic. It was surgical. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. She was giving the country a manual. She was stripping away excuses. She was handing the powerless their first real shield. And in doing so, she turned the courtroom into a classroom, the gavel into a warning bell, and her own scars into lessons no one could ignore. But the lesson wasn't soft. It carried a warning too. Power will always strike first. It will always intimidate. It will always use fear to make you fold before the fight begins. Thomas tried to drown her in a $500 million fine, not because he expected to collect it, but because he expected her to collapse under its weight. That's how power works. It throws mountains at you and hopes you break. But Jasmine's message said otherwise. She reminded us that even mountains crumble when you expose the cracks. She didn't deny fear. She carried it into the room and still moved forward. That's the part people don't talk about enough. The message wasn't "don't be afraid." The message was "be afraid and fight anyway," because proof is stronger than fear. That's why the country believed her. She didn't stand as a symbol of invincibility. She stood as proof that vulnerability, when armed with truth, is more dangerous than arrogance with all the power in the world. This is why her message outlived the courtroom. It traveled through classrooms where law students rewrote their notes. It lived in factories where workers pinned her quote on bulletin boards. It spread in churches where pastors preached not just faith in God, but faith in truth. And it burned in the minds of children watching the hearings with their parents, learning for the first time that courage isn't loud. It's clear. The lesson wasn't fight power, the lesson was disarm power. Strip it of secrecy, strip it of silence, strip it of the shadows where it thrives. That's what proof does. It doesn't just defend, it exposes. And once exposed, even the mightiest figure in the highest court of the land can crumble in real time. That's what they saw. That's what they'll never forget. And that is why Jasmine's words are not just history, they are instruction. They are a torch passed down, not to Congress, not to lawyers, not to judges, but to every citizen who has ever been told to shut up, to sit down, to accept. She proved acceptance is a choice, and silence is complicity. The true human weight of her message is this: dignity does not come from titles. It comes from standing when you're told to kneel. Justice does not come from robes, it comes from persistence. And power? Power is nothing more than an illusion, one that collapses the second someone pulls back the curtain. Jasmine pulled it back and said to the world, "Here, look, that act alone is what changed everything." So when she said, "That's what I did," it wasn't arrogance. It wasn't boastful. It was an invitation, a challenge, a dare. She was telling the nation that courage is contagious, that proof is universal, that silence is no longer acceptable. She wasn't asking to be celebrated. She was demanding that others carry the fire forward. Her story could have ended with her silenced, crushed by the fine, erased by the weight of tradition. But it didn't. And the reason it didn't is the message itself, that truth doesn't vanish when it's cornered. It fights back. That's what Jasmine wanted people to understand. That's why her words still echo like gunfire in the marble halls. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. Because in the end, the story wasn't about Thomas falling. It wasn't about Jasmine rising. It was about the people watching, realizing that the next time power comes for them, they are not defenseless. They have the same weapon Jasmine carried. And if they choose to use it, the system will never be safe from its own people again. That is the meaning. That is the legacy. Not scandal, not politics. Proof, courage, refusal. The blueprint for survival in a world that tries every day to convince you you're too small to fight back. Jasmine proved you're not. And so the message endures, sharper than any verdict, louder than any gavel, more lasting than any law. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. That's what I did. But a message without action is just an echo, and Jasmine's fight demanded more than echoes. This is the moment where watching isn't enough. The courtroom may have been Jasmine's battlefield, but outside those walls, the fight belongs to us. Every person who saw her stand, every citizen who heard her words, now carries the same responsibility: to keep proof alive, to demand accountability, to refuse silence. Because the truth is not self-sustaining, it needs people willing to protect it, spread it, and wield it when power comes knocking. That is not theory, that is survival. Ask yourself, how many times have you looked away, thinking the system was too big to challenge? How many times have you believed corruption was unstoppable, or that one voice could never be enough? Jasmine Crockett just proved otherwise. She showed us that the line between collapse and change is not armies or billions. It's courage paired with evidence. And that line is waiting for every one of us to step onto it. So here is the call. Do not sit back. Do not wait for the next hero. Become the person who brings receipts when lies flood the room. Become the worker who documents injustice in the workplace. Become the neighbor who stands up when communities are ignored. Proof is not locked in congressional folders. It lives in your hands, your phones, your records, your voices. And silence is exactly what corruption counts on to keep winning. Jasmine's words are not just a quote to admire, they are a command. If they come for you with power, answer with proof. That is your shield. That is your weapon. That is your duty. The next chapter will not be written by those who stay quiet. It will be written by those who step forward, not with rage, but with evidence. So take the lesson, take the courage, take the proof, and move. Because the system will only change when you force it to. And the time is not someday, the time is now. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.